If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 536, The First Task, 2. The reason this was foolish was that due to living in the mountains, the species relied on scent and hearing to determine the location of prey rather than sight. As a result, all the blinding of it did was piss off the dragon, that immediately chose to torch Crumb in retaliation. Clearly this result was unexpected, and the boy took some serious burns on his shoulder as he dove out of the way. Crumb gritted his teeth from behind the rock he was taking refuge in and got aggressive with the creative use of the bird summoning charm Avis to summon a flock of pigeons in front of the dragon. This was a good move, as the overload of smell and sound that the spell caused the dragon was enough for him to slip under it and snatch the golden egg before retreating. There was of course the moment that the dragon raged out after discovering the loss of an egg before the handlers put it under again and transported it out of the arena. The next dragon was the Hungarian horntail, that definitely was not in the best of moods as it shot fire at the crowds regularly. As it turned out, there were a group of hit wizards tasked with specifically raising a barrier around the crowd to keep out any attacks towards it. It was an interesting variation of the standard Protego charm that needed more than one caster in exchange for being much stronger. Fleur ended up with this dragon, however, which proved to be a problem for her. She tried to get it with an illusion of rats, but the angry reptile bathed the whole arena in flames, dispersing it and forcing her to take cover. Even worse was that unlike most brooding dragon, the horntail species had the philosophy of active defense and thus didn't just remain stationary but came after Fleur, fully intent on killing her. The crowd watched in nervous excitement as the bird woman ran for her life while taking horrible burns and more than a few cuts and scrapes as she snatched the golden egg and ran out the exit. That was the last straw for the angry dragon, as it broke its chain and attempted to chase her through the tunnel, with even the spells of the handlers being rendered useless to calm the beast. Nick raised his hand palm forward and with a clench of his fist adamantium chains were transfigured from the stone ground and bound the dragon in place with its snout shut. Eventually the handlers managed to get the dragon under control and Nick released the transfiguration under the awestruck eyes of the crowd. He earned applause for his assistance and a thankful nod from Dumbledore as the task continued after a short break. Harry's dragon was the Chinese fireball, which he was admittedly much better prepared to take on than the other two champions were. It showed too, as he first used transfiguration to create high walls of stone to block the dragon's senses before he disillusioned himself and snuck up behind it and took the egg smoothly. The walls were also a trick that made the dragon think that he was coming from the front when he was in fact coming from behind it. With that performance done, the first task was over and it was time for the champions to get their scores. Harry of course got the top score for cleverly misdirecting the creature and taking his egg without any injury. Crumb came up in second place since his tactic was pretty textbook and he adapted to the ineffectiveness of it. Fleur was in last as her entire performance was merely a bunch of failure and panicking on her part. She glared at Nick when the judges mentioned how he had felt the need to step in to contain the dragon after she fled. For once her irritation was not misplaced, as that was a low blow on Bagman's part that could have been done without. All it served to accomplish was make the Vila more angry at Nick, which was a bad idea to begin with. Madame Maxime and Dumbledore both publicly chastised the large man for doing it too. The funny part was that the man was likely only doing it to try and hype the tournament more for the papers, but probably didn't realize that Rita, who was in charge of reporting on it, refused to write about Nick. He knew her secret as an animagus and made it clear he would spill it if she tried to report on him like she usually does everyone else. To put it bluntly, it was a wasted effort to try and create drama like this with Nick for publicity. Chapter 537, The After Party. Harry, you were brilliant, mate. Ron said excitedly as the group met up with him after the task ended. Thanks, Ron, I guess those hints at fighting dragons really came in handy. Harry said with a grin at Nick. I can't talk about the tasks while the tournament's on, especially not with you champions, signed a contract you see. Nick said with a shrug. Makes sense, got me curious why you had to sign one of those though. Harry said curiously. I suppose you'll just have to figure that out on your own, it should easy for you specifically. Nick said vaguely. Rita tried to grab Harry for another interview, but he effectively told her to fuck off and headed up into the castle with most of the rest of the group. Ron had to go and send a letter to his mom since she asked for one after the task ended. There was a whole celebration in the Gryffindor common room and Harry got egged on into opening the golden egg so that they all could hear the hints it contained. What they got instead was high-pitched screaming until Harry shut the egg again and it went silent. Bloody hell, how in Merlin's saggy robes is anyone supposed to understand that? Seamus complained while twirling his pinky in his ear to try and get out the ringing in it. Harry gave Nick a pleading look but only got a shaken head back. I don't know about you guys, but I think I'm going to go take a bath. All that excitement really makes me want to soak my head underwater. Nick said before leaving. No one seemed to find what he said as strange and merely saw him off. Nobody but Harry, however, that looked like he found a clue to follow but wanted to celebrate his current victory for the moment. Nick wasn't just leaving a hint for his friend though, but really intended to get a bath in the room of requirement since he wanted one. Sure, he could get clean with magic, but sometimes it was nice to just soak for a bit in scalding hot water. The room was also filled with things Nick wanted to grab before he graduated at the end of this year. Books, notes, scrolls and other objects that had been lost there over the last 1,000 years. The room of hidden things was very expansive after all, and Nick never really bothered trying to sort through everything till now. After his bath he left the room and let the door fade away before summoning the door to the room of hidden things and got to work. Anything useless or broken he fed to his realm as raw material, while the rest were sorted according to what they were used for. The cursed objects were identified and had their curses catalogued before he fed them to the realm, which boosted the mana and matter of it. The useful or antique stuff was set aside behind him as he worked his way through the sea of things. Books, notes, scrolls or documents were placed in his collection within the realm so long as they weren't cursed, and if they were he would crack the curse before doing so, unless doing so ruined the value of the texts. More than once the curses on the texts were actually needed in order to facilitate learning the magical knowledge written down. Nick also found more than a few experimental potions, ingredients, or even bizarre items like alchemized items. Like the cursed items, he identified and either stored or destroyed the stuff he found. Even though he was quick and efficient in this process, he barely emptied a single % of the room's contents by the end of the day. This is going to be a problem, isn't it? Nick thought with a sigh. The sheer amount of stuff in the room was insane, and since most of it was magical, he actually had to take a moment to identify what it was all about. Nick was halfway tempted to see if Dobby could sort it, but felt it would be rather wasteful after consideration. The house elf was currently dealing with the rather odd side effect of Nick becoming a realm lord. The magical bond between them had caused the house elf to start a sort of evolution in an unknown direction. As a result, the pitiful creature was pretty much bedridden for the time being, as the dense mana on the island helped nourish its changing anatomy. Which direction this change was heading Nick had no clue, but it should be interesting at least. Chapter 538, Busy. Nick left the room after that and ate dinner before calling it a day. The next morning he woke up to the sky being overcast and dark as a storm had rolled over while he was asleep. I was going to go collect some souls in the forest, but this weather is simply dreadful, he thought and shrugged. Nick walked down into the common room after getting dressed and was surprised to see that someone was already awake. It was Hermione with a sleepy expression as she pored over a book. "Stayed up all night, I take it?" he asked, startling the girl. "Ah, it's just you, Nick. Yes, I was up all last night trying to find anything about that strange sound that the golden egg released. No luck so far, I'm afraid," she said disappointedly. "Here, this should help you get through the day without accidentally falling asleep," Nick said, taking out an energy potion. She looked grateful as she drank it and instantly peppied up. "What potion is that? I've never had anything quite like it," she asked curiously. "Doesn't have an official name, but I refer to it as sleep in a bottle since drinking it gives the same effects as a full night's rest," he said honestly. "Are there any side effects?" she asked, and Nick shook his head. "Not unless you try and use it as a substitute for real sleep on a regular basis. It's good for all-nighters like what you did, but shouldn't be used all the time," he said casually. "Where did you get it from?" she asked, clearly interested in the potion. "I stole it from Salazar Slytherin himself. Man has an entire library with his life's knowledge recorded in it that I have memorized and mastered," he said with a grin. "Where did you really get it from?" Hermione asked, not believing him. "I did get it from a book written by Slytherin. I had Snape help me make some last year," Nick said honestly. "You really have a book written by one of the founders?" Hermione asked in astonishment when she realized that Nick wasn't messing about. "A whole library of them, in fact. I was even planning to share them with Dumbledore before I graduated," he said casually. Hermione just stared at him with a gaping mouth for a few moments as she realized that he was telling the truth. "How can you be so calm about something like that? It's a huge discovery," she exclaimed in shock. "In about 2 or 3 years you'll understand that it really isn't that big of a deal," Nick said ominously before leaving her in the common room, as he had stuff to do. So much to do and so little time to do it, he thought with a sigh. This was not him complaining either, as he really did have quite the list of things he needed to do. Make the chambers, work on copying the library, empty out the room of hidden things, work on his Twilight-style crafting, work on the organic smithing stuff, read and master the knowledge in the lexicon, prepare to graduate, deal with the royal vampires, expand his Atronak army, hone his skill and control over his power and even more. Each and every one of these things would take up time to do and he needed to do all of them. Some were more long-term type things but others had the deadline of by the end of this year, so he was quite pressed for time. For today though, Nick chose to continue working on the chambers that had been commissioned and just before the first task been half paid for. The other half of the payment would come when he delivered the goods. He was faster in creating these new chambers because he had the rough skeleton of runic enchantments for them already done after the task chamber's creation. The part that slowed him down was the specification and details that each person wanted for their chamber. In a way, Nick was building each set of enchantments up one block at a time while making sure they don't clash somewhere or remove room for growth. The golems were even harder to create as they weren't static things but mimicked the real creatures that they were based on and had to be carefully constructed to be easily reparable as well as energy efficient so they didn't just run out of power in the middle of a simulation fight. Achieving all that while programming them to behave just like the real deal made them highly advanced pieces of magical engineering. Thankfully they were in fact a matter of copy and pasting the enchantment after he made a single model of every type. Chapter 539, Busy, 2. He was making good progress on the chambers though as he was working on the final touches of the one that Beauxbatons wanted for the DMLE since it was the simplest of the three. It was basically just a hyper-realistic training simulation of combat against other wizards, which was the DMLE's bread and butter. With that in mind, obviously the golem wizards needed to have a variety of spells and adaptable programming to work as good training partners. As an added bit of flair though, Nick created a secret scenario in the chamber with a golem meant to imitate Voldemort for anyone able to beat the highest setting of the other golems. He doubted the golem would have much use in the next few years, but as the wizarding world's average level of power rises it will change. That was of course with the assumption that the battles with Zeus doesn't kill off nearly everyone on the planet that is. The next day Nick finished up the chamber and after putting it through its paces to check for flaws and bugs was able to give it to Beauxbatons. The woman herself was the first person to truly test the chamber and she came out sweaty but satisfied with it. The chamber was installed in an empty room in the ministry and put into use immediately with the Aurors and Aurors in training trying it out curiously. Nick didn't mention it but he secretly gave Amelia a discount on the price after he figured out that she hadn't spent the money the ministry gave to the DMLE but rather her own Bones family fortune for the chamber. He could respect that she was willing to inconvenience herself so greatly in order to improve her department's future and by extension the community's as well as the Aurors became better at their jobs. Karkaroff's chamber took 3 more days to finish as while it wasn't as realistic as Amelia's it was more diverse as there were more types of environments and golems as well as a lot of scenarios built into the various possible combinations of them. Nick had offered to install the room directly in Dimstrang but Karkaroff just waved him off so it was put in the hold of the ship that the school showed up in. This left the Beauxbatons chamber to be built in its entirety. Nick hadn't even started on it for one reason in particular. It was stupidly complex and needed a huge amount of input from Madame Maxime about literally everything. The woman asked for the full package and Nick going to deliver so he needed a great deal of stuff to add to the chamber. Magic conductive stone for the chamber itself, several dozen pounds of mithril for the runic inlay, a dozen alchemically treated gemstones for storing and releasing mana to power the whole thing and then the stupidly long book of runic sentences he needed to create in order to make the simulation as realistic as possible. Weather, environmental factors, reactive environments that truly seemed alive, and a bunch of other details to be built into the chamber alone. Add in the golems that may as well be false life forms with how complex and reactive they are and the sheer variety of them and you can understand the insane construct he was creating. So extreme that both of Nick's bodies had to be within the realm working on it at the same time to get any decent progress on the chamber done. And that was in accelerated time to boot. At the end of the week Nick took a break from working on the chambers and moved to copying the books in the library for the next week with food and bathroom breaks. Nick no longer required true sleep after becoming a realm lord so while his elven body rested he was still awake and using his Daedric body instead. It felt natural to use it but he still had a few issues that he was working on such as the claws at the end of his fingers making grabbing things without damaging them difficult to say the least. It was basically the same as having razors on the end of one's fingers that were capable of being gently dragged across steel and cleaving it apart like water. There was no clipping the thing either as they were both highly durable and the body grew them back in moments after they were actually cut down. Thanks to the attempt however Nick discovered that his Daedric body was a veritable treasure trove as each part was magical in nature and thus had various uses. His claw clippings for example made powerful wand cores if used for it. Comment. 17 Comment. Vote. Chapter 540, Royal Visit. By the middle of November there was finally a change in the monotonous nature of Nick's life as Hogwarts got a rather controversial visitor. A woman with pale skin, red eyes, and long blonde hair like silk, Mina Teeps the Vampire Princess. Dumbledore played the part of host when she suddenly seemed to show up out of nowhere. Nick only discovered her presence due to seeing her at the head table during dinner when she made no effort to hide the fact she was staring at him. What is she doing here and why do I have this ominous feeling, he thought confused. As it turned out he didn't need to wait very long to learn why at all as the woman sought him out on her own. What are you? She asked bluntly as she walked up to him while he was in the library. You don't need to know. Nick said without looking at her at all. She frowned. You could at least look at me when I am speaking to you, or did we not have a good time at the ball? She asked with a pout. Nick sighed and left a bookmark in the book he was copying before looking at her. It was a single dance and if I am not mistaken you rather forced the issue, no? He said with clear annoyance. Bah, you know you loved every second of it, besides I don't let just anyone touch me in such an intimate fashion. She said dismissively. You didn't exactly leave me much choice in the matter when you loudly said that I was afraid to dance with you. It wasn't even a good dance since you stepped on my feet 3 times during it. Nick retorted and she looked embarrassed. Enough playing coy, why are you here? He added firmly. TCH, you are no fun at all. If you must know, my father sent me here after he heard a rumor that you were going to be graduating this year. He didn't trust the mirrors to keep it secret with the offer he has for you. She said, turning serious. I already have plans for after graduation, so I doubt I would be very interested in whatever he is offering. Nick said honestly. Not even when it pertains to an ancient wizard's tomb that was recently discovered deep inside one of our mines. She asked with a teasing smile. While that is interesting, I really do have plans also. Now I know for a fact you are lying to me because he already asked me about that place 2 days ago, which you would know if you didn't avoid him like the plague. So spill it, why are you here really? Nick said, and Mina pouted at getting played. Why don't you guess? She asked playfully. You are testing my patience, so speak clearly or leave, I don't care which. He said, officially out of patience to deal with her nonsense. Fine, have it your way then. She said angrily before storming off. 3 reasons she's here at this time. First is she has some plan that involves me. Second, she is trying to seduce me, again. Third is that she is just messing around just for the hell of it. I'm leaning towards the third option here, he thought as he opened the book he was on again to continue copying it. Mina Teeps was in many ways the exact opposite of Nick in that she was a free-spirited individual who does whatever she wanted without care for consequences. In recent times she had taken an interest in Nick for some god's awful reason, and despite what he might think, everyone assured him it wasn't romantically either. He found that hard to believe when she had taken to flirting with him both in person and over the mirror she stole from one of his shipments of them. Hell, even Vlad said that she was likely more interested in the fact he denied her to her face. She was a spoiled child and revered by nearly everyone she met, so his rejection of her was new and interesting. According to Vlad, she was probably trying to be friendly with him but had literally no idea how. In all regards, Nick considered it a headache to deal with since he didn't have time to be wasting on her whims. Later that evening, Mina went and started a rumor that they were engaged, which caused Nick to have more than a few people ask him about it. It wasn't bad enough to get Vlad involved, as it was mostly harmless fun on her part, but it was still more than a little irritating to deal with. Chapter 541, Uncomfortable Peace. Besides that, however, Nick found it almost uncomfortable how there was nothing threatening in the background of this year. Sure, Grindelwald will probably end up completing his grand ritual by the end of the year, but Nick had known about that for years now and had been preparing for it based on what he knew. He had even discarded his mortality almost entirely since he knew about the return of the gods and how Zeus was most likely going to clash with him heavily. There was no magical abomination or noseless freak in the background planning on causing trouble. It was just mundane problems like a socially stunted royal vampire and the Triwizard tournament. Speaking of the tournament, Harry had already figured out the hint Nick gave him with the egg and was now trying to figure out the hint from the egg as well. Unlike in the canon, however, the hint in the egg wasn't so straightforward in pointing to the task's challenges. No, this time it was pretty damn cryptic, with the exception of almost flat-out revealing that Nick had something to do with the task. This had caused a headache in the form of the champions secretly spying on Nick to try and glean anything about the task itself. Fine, I guess I can throw them a bone just to get them off my back. Nick thought a few days after the stalking started. The way he did this was by simply acting all secretive when he grabbed a book on treasure hunting in the library. He then set it back on the shelf upside down after appearing to read it for a few moments. Over the next 2 weeks he repeated this process as he copied the books in the library and worked on the last remaining chamber. The trick worked too, as by the 1st of December all 3 champions had stopped shadowing him and were now scrambling to figure out the rest of the egg's hint. Harry had the frankly unfair advantage in the fact that he had Hermione helping him with it, and that girl was nothing if not dedicated to scouring out information in the library and logicking her way through any troubles she has. Unfortunately for her, quite a bit of the hint was purposefully misleading in order to throw off the champions. The night of December 1st, however, they all had other problems to deal with, as Dumbledore announced the Yule Ball to be held on the night of Christmas, starting at 8 and ending at midnight. The professors had already told their students of the event, so it hadn't caught anyone off guard when the old goat announced it. That said, Ron was positively miserable, as not only did he not have someone to ask to the ball at the moment, but his dress robe was horribly outdated. They wore this puffy frilly maroon set of robes that made Nick have a headache to look at. "You know, I can have a tuxedo made up from you at Madame Malkin's for the ball if you'd like, or you can borrow one of my own suits after I get it retailored to fit you, since our sizes aren't much different," Nick offered, feeling bad for him. The twins had shelled out from their cash stash for their own set of ball apparel, and thus Ron alone had to wear old hand-me-down robes. "Really?" The redhead perked up at the offer, and Nick nodded. It honestly wasn't even that hard, as after giving Madame Malkin's his measurements, the woman said she'd have it done within a week. On the 5th, however, Mina decided to show up in the library again to find Nick about a quarter done from the looks of it. "Father might actually be jealous by the time you are done," she said offhandedly. "I assume you are here in regards to the Yule Ball?" Nick asked calmly without looking up from the book he was copying. "One of these days you're going to tell me why I can't sneak up on you," she said with a pout after failing to get a reaction from him. "I have a very good sense of perception," Nick said with a smirk, knowing that answer would only irritate her more. "So do you have a date yet for it?" she asked, ignoring his vague answer. "I do not, but I was planning on fixing that soon enough. She's a wonderful little blonde with a bubbly personality and is fun to be around," Nick said, setting Mina up for a misunderstanding. "She sounds like quite the catch," Mina said with a pleased look as she took it hook, line and sinker. "Yes, Luna truly is a wonderful girl," Nick said with a wide grin as Mina stiffened. Chapter 542, New Edition. The vampire princess went through 3 changes in mood in quick succession as she understood what Nick had said. The first was confusion because the name he said was not her own, the second was realization that he was baiting her, and the third was anger at falling for it. The library was usually fairly quiet, but as she released her bloodlust it got deathly silent. Regardless of all else, she was still a powerful Tier 4 being, so to everyone in the library it was like death was leaning over their shoulder, whispering in their ears that it was there. Nick sighed and flicked her on the forehead, snapping her out of it and letting everyone else in the library breath out in relief. "Learn to take a joke or you'll find your stay here at Hogwarts much shorter than you may like," he chastised her firmly. She might be there for him, but Nick wasn't going to let her stay at the school if she turned murderous every time he played a prank on her. That wasn't a laughing matter, as she was legitimately wanting to kill something just now over his little prank. "Humph! You were the one who played with my feelings to begin with," she shot back angrily. "First, you aren't even interested in me like that, second, nobody is stopping you from leaving, and finally you are the literal last person I would ever ask to go to the ball with me. That rumor you started is already irritating enough as it is, I don't need to add more fuel to the fire," Nick said calmly. "How can you possibly know how I feel?" she asked with a scoff. "Because you are a cat," Nick said bluntly. "What?" she asked, dumbfounded. "Have ever seen the way cats act in general as a species? They are vain and apathetic creatures in most instances. They want attention on their terms, and if they want to mate they make it abundantly clear, while they are easily distracted and constantly seek stimulation. You mean a teeps, are a cat and thus easy to understand," Nick explained, and he could see that as much as she wanted to deny it, the comparison was uncomfortably accurate. "The fact is that because you have had whatever you wanted on a silver spoon your whole life, so finding someone that denies you has your interest piqued. You want to be friends with me, and that is totally fine, but flirting is simply not the way to go about it," he added for good measure before returning to his copying while she was left to her thoughts. He meant it too, as he was perfectly okay with being friends with her, but all the advances on him that she didn't actually mean were annoying to deal with. The talk seemed to work too, as Mina vanished for the next week before randomly choosing to insert herself into Nick's hangout with his friends. Calling that awkward would have been the understatement of the year, as besides Luna that had the magical ability to gel with pretty much anyone who wasn't an insufferable jerk, the others had no idea how to approach the vampire. They couldn't ask about what it was like being a vampire either, as Mina was born one and simply couldn't explain the difference since she had never experienced it herself. "So like, how old are you anyways?" Ron eventually asked, and every single person in the room looked at him like he was an idiot. "Mate, you don't ask a woman that, like ever." "She's 105. Nick said with a grin as he directly exposed her age. Is that a lot for a vampire? Ron asked, not sure about it. Depends on the vampire, but for a natural born like her, not really. She's barely considered an adult by natural born standards, so in human years like 17 or so. Nick said with a shrug. When did you become an expert on the subject anyways? Tracy asked, confused. I think it would be rather strange if I didn't know a good deal about them, since I have a fairly good relationship with the royals and even have the ear of the king of vampires himself, her dad, for context. Nick said honestly. Of course you do. Daphne said with a tired sigh after hearing what he said. Aren't vampires considered dark creatures though? No offense meant, of course. Hermione asked while covering her bases with Mina. They are indeed, but like most things it is more complicated than it seems. See, the things that the Ministry and most wizards are most concerned about are the blood thralls and lower vampire species that have a bad habit of being bloodthirsty monsters that kill everything they come across. Above that is the true vampires that are basically just people that drink blood to survive but are otherwise just the same as everyone else. He explained honestly. Chapter 543, Changes. After ironing out all of the questions that there were in regards to vampires, Mina was accepted into the group without issue. Things got much more relaxed after that as she stopped bothering Nick and focused her attention on the other members of the group instead. Luna had also accepted Nick's invitation to the ball, and the mere fact he had asked her had gotten him several teases from his fiends, but he had expected it to begin with and was unbothered. Nick had noticed something concerning, however, that he could see becoming a problem later. His pride had mutated after becoming a fully Daedric being, and he couldn't help but feel an instinctual disdain for the people around him. He kept it under control, but it was clear that his elevated state wasn't entirely positive for him. It was not an issue at the moment, as he had his friends and people like Dumbledore and Nicholas Flamel to keep him grounded, but eventually most of those would crumble and fade or cease to anchor him. Thankfully Nick was fairly certain that that was a far into the future sort of issue. 2 days before Christmas Nick finally completed the chamber for Beauxbatons, and it was a thing of marvel for him. So realistic and varied that the inside could easily pass for the real deal regardless of which environment or enemy one would face. His favorite part though was that he added an adaptation feature to the chamber and golems so that it was no longer a one-size-fits-all type thing. Like if someone discovered a loophole in a scenario and exploited it, the chamber and golems would change the scenario slightly to punish the next person if they tried to repeat the exploit. It is magnificent, Nick. Madame Maxime said after trying the chamber out herself. If I am being honest, I almost don't want to give it up. Nick admitted. That just means that it's as good as I had hoped for then. She said with a wide smile. I am happy you like it, and please do have a good evening. He said before leaving, since his schedule had finally opened up a bit. This meant that he now had the time to focus exclusively on copying the library books and emptying out the room of hidden things. Speaking of that room, Nick had found some strange things in that place as he fed his realm the vast majority of it. A whole mummy, a kin filled with human teeth, a leprechaun's big toe on a string, and several other unusual or flat-out weird objects that boggled the mind. In terms of cursed items, Nick was disgusted to find that after getting about 10% through the room's contents, he had hundreds of unique curses recorded. Most were fairly harmless, but others were totally messed up, like ruin someone's life messed up. He wasn't even sure how, but someone had trapped the Maledictus curse in a small brightly colored orb that was set to infect the person who touched it. Nick took great pleasure destroying the horrible object by feeding it to his realm that was growing greatly. Not physically, as there was not enough in the room to cause much change in the size of the planet in the realm, but rather magically. The one ley line that the realm had from the core's integration had tripled into 3 thanks to all the pure magic that came from breaking down the curses with the realm. In a not-so-surprising twist, the realm was uniquely suited for handling curses, which Nick was willing to bet heavily was due to the realm's Daedric nature. In Nirn, Daedra were infamous for their curses, so it made perfect sense that the affinity for them was a part of their race. Nick himself likely also had a great affinity for curses, but refused to cast them due to the corruptive effects of such dark magic. In this regard he was a bit unique in terms of Daedra, as unlike nearly all of them that couldn't be corrupted by dark magic because they themselves were innately dark magic oriented, he was the exact opposite, as he was light magic oriented instead. In a way he was smack dab in the middle between a Daedra and a Daedra, with him leaning towards Daedra due to how he became this way. Anyways, more ley lines meant that the concentration of mana in the air of the realm was even greater. It wasn't quite at the same level as Hogwarts at the moment, but it was fast approaching that point. Late into the night of this day, Dobby finally completed their evolution, and the changes were drastic. Chapter 544, Changes, 2. The first thing Nick noticed was that Dobby had grown taller, nearly double their original height in fact. In addition to that, their body had filled out to more human-like proportions while their face had become less wrinkled and more human-like. At the top of Dobby's forehead 2 small nub-looking horns stuck out as well. The most off-putting change, however, was the eyes that had changed to have black sclera and slit pupils like a serpent. "How do you feel?" Nick asked his servant when they appeared in front of him at Hogwarts. "Incredible, sir. Like this one was but a slug before and now stands as a wolf," Dobby said with a wide smile. "That is good. I hadn't expected that my own transformation would affect you as well, and I apologize for any discomfort you may have experienced as a result," Nick said honestly. "My lord need not apologize to this lowly one. It is Dobby's privilege to serve one so grand as you," it said with a deep bow. Nick easily spotted that the thought process of his servant had taken a qualitative step forward from the simplistic nature of house elves and was more like that of a normal person's. In addition to this, there was another metaphysical change in the form of Dobby's essence and power. To even call Dobby a house elf would be a massive error, as on an evolutionary scale it was now much higher up. Dobby's essence had also become Daedric in nature, with a clear tie to the realm, much like Nick himself, and as a Daedra the servant's power had undergone an earth-shattering transformation. If before it was a match flame, it was now a raging bonfire that could threaten most people. The magical power of magical creatures like goblins and house elves was generally more powerful than a wizard's, but far from efficient, as they had no focus for it. Now, though, Dobby's power required no focus, much like how Nick himself no longer needed one. That was just the sort of creatures Daedra were. Their bodies were more than adequate to serve the same function. What this meant was that now Dobby could perform much greater feats of magic than before, and as such was a force to be reckoned with. The way that house elves used magic was different than the way wizards did, so most of the time the defenses that were set up against other wizards simply failed against house elves. Dobby, like most house elves, was a tier 3 being, but with this transformation it was not impossible for even Dumbledore to be given a run for his money against them. Besides all else, however, Dobby was a servant and as such will not act in any way that might inconvenience Nick, at least not intentionally. "Return to the manor and practice with your new power so we can understand your limits better," Nick said after noticing that people were starting to stare. "As you command, my lord," Dobby said before disappearing like mist, much to the astonishment of those watching. To them it must have appeared as though a first year was talking with Nick at first, but the longer they looked the more the details were off. Add to that the fact that Dobby operated away in a place well known to be impossible to do so in, and the shock was not surprising at all. Nick knew that the information would get around eventually, but he didn't really care since he could handle the blowback for it. "Now that I think about it, calling Dobby a house elf is no longer correct, but what should this new race be called then?" Nick pondered seriously. "Perhaps Hyldra, from the Aldmeri language word for servant, and the Daedra." "Yes, I think that will be a perfect name, the Hyldra. A new race of Daedra exclusive to my realm." Nick thought, pleased with the name he had chosen. There was nothing else worth noting in the next 2 days, and soon enough it was the day of Christmas itself. Nick woke up nice and early as per his usual and saw the ungodly amount of gifts he had at the foot and sides of his bed, just like last year. More than a few of them had letters attached to, which was annoying to say the least. Once again, most of the gifts were from people that had attended the Blitzball tournament over the summer, who were fans of it and wanted to show their appreciation for him creating the sport. Few of these came with letters, thankfully. More stuff to add to the collection, I guess, Nick thought with a shrug as he carefully stored away the stuff that the various players and teams of the sport had sent to him with their signatures on it. Chapter 545, Christmas. There was another strange set of gifts as well from various people around the world that were thankfully more reasonable than last year. For example, lumber from their local trees, such as snacky wood from South America. Other than that, it was mostly food once again, which Nick was perfectly fine with, as he quite enjoyed the stuff he got from last Christmas. "Is every year going to be like this for you from now on?" Ron asked jealously when he woke up to see the huge amount of presents Nick got. "It should lessen after this year, since everyone will have better things to do than send me stuff," Nick said calmly while eating some fruit jerky from Brazil that seemed to be made with acai, mango and bananas. From the looks of it, the food was crushed together and then dried in the sun before getting broken up. Still, it was sweet and had a good flavor to it, so Nick enjoyed it immensely. "Did you get anything interesting like last year?" Harry asked curiously. "Well, I got a few things that could be considered interesting, I suppose, but nothing weird, thankfully," Nick said honestly. "Mum sent another sweater from the looks of it," Ron said, opening a gift from his mom that was indeed another sweater. It was maroon like every year with a big orange R on the front of it. "I got one." "Me too," Nick and Harry said, opening their gifts from her as well. Harry's sweater was red with a yellow H on it and Nick's was blue with a white N on the front. They put them on before moving back to the rest of their gifts. Thanks Nick. Ron said excitedly as he opened the gift that Nick had given him. It was an ornate silver and green wood carving knife that Nick created out of the light of a star with his twilight style. That star's material in particular had the unique property of improving wood that it was in contact with, which paired wonderfully with veritology. It wasn't a major improvement, but it would certainly increase the quality of any wand or staff carved using it. Sadly, it only worked on raw wood, so any treated or finished wands got no benefit from it. Nick still wanted to find a way to elevate his own wand, as it was unfortunately starting to have difficulty growing to match his power. This wasn't because of the materials that comprised it, but rather that the techniques that crafted it were never pushed to this length and were starting to falter. While it was true that a wand was able to grow nigh infinitely, that growth was meant to be slow and steady like a wizard's own growth, not the constant leaps forward that Nick made in a relatively short period. Even now Nick's wand had not fully adapted to his transformation over the summer, and thus was mostly for decoration if he didn't want to destroy it. The shows of magic he had been doing that looked to use his wand had in fact actually been him wandlessly casting spells under the guise of using a wand. What even is this? Harry asked, confused, when he opened his own gift. Ah yes, the puzzle box. I am quite proud of that little thing. Like the name implies, it is a box that is sealed shut via a puzzle of my own design that you'll find is quite challenging. It has a very large expanded space inside it that you can use to store anything you would like safely. Nick explained proudly. How do you open it then? Ron asked, interested, as it was a cool-looking item. Like this. Nick said, and placed Harry's thumb out that struck the locking mechanism and was accepted. The box then started to twist and click as it rearranged itself and grew larger in size until it was the size of a trunk before the entrance opened up like an eye dilating. Wicked! Harry said as he looked inside the opening that was just empty space with nothing in it at this time. Right now the pattern for the puzzle is you simply pressing your thumb on the lock there, but while the box is open you can input a new opening sequence based on how you move your thumb. Try sliding your thumb down and to the left. Nick said, and Harry did it, and the box clicked a few times before closing again. Now to open the box you have to place your thumb on the lock before moving it down and then to the left. Nick explained with a grin. What if I forget the pattern? Harry asked, worried. Chapter 546, Christmas, 2. As the person the box is bound to at the moment, you can reset it by pressing that symbol there. Nick said, pointing out the Deathly Hallows symbol on the box's side. I think I got it. Harry said with a nod. You sure you aren't playing favorites? I just got a blade while he got that complicated looking storage box. Ron asked teasingly. I gave each of you a present that I believed you would find most useful for your endeavors. Harry seems to be leaning towards being an aura and thus will need an easy-to-access storage means that would be difficult for others to use. You instead are on the path of veritology, and so I gave you a carving blade that improves the wood you carve with it. Hermione got a quill that writes out your thoughts with a bit of discretion, of course. Tracy got a few primers on weaponry and forging, while Daphne got a runic engraver of my own design with the entire Elder Futhark alphabet pre-programmed into it for easy runic writing. As for Mina, she got some Hydra's blood from my island. Nick explained calmly. You have a Hydra? Ron asked in shock. There is one on my island, yes. Aggressive little bastard attacks anything that gets too close to the pond, which is why that area is closed off. Nick said with a huff. He could see why the species originally went extinct, as if they all acted like that then they probably made pests of themselves by hoarding important watering holes, causing them to be hunted down to the last. It probably didn't help that their bodies were full of useful ingredients. Venom, scales, gall, blood, eyes, and brains were all highly useful things to wizards. Those have been extinct since over 1,000 years ago. How in Merlin's name did you get it? Ron asked curiously. It was originally a horned water snake actually, but due to the conditions on my island it managed to awaken its ancestors' bloodline and turn into a hydra. Sadly, the other horned water snakes on the island didn't follow its lead, so I only have the one. Nick said with a shrug. It's a good thing no one knows you have it, or a lot of people would come after you to get it. Ron said seriously. That was also true given how messed up humans tend to be when profit was involved, a flaw wizards shared as well. Moving on from that, they got to see the gifts from the normal lot, such as Sirius, Lupin, and each other. Nick's gifts were amongst the most extravagant, but considering he made them himself or harvested them personally in the case of the Hydra's blood, that was par for the course. Most of what Nick got was books or food, which made him chuckle as it seemed to be what everyone agreed he liked. They weren't wrong though, as he did indeed enjoy those things above most others. He enjoyed pushing his knowledge to new heights just as much as he did the subtle nuances of flavor that came from food. The gifts the other two got were more varied as their interests weren't as focused as his, but they still enjoyed the candy gifts that they got. There was one present however that Nick wasn't expecting to get, that if anyone else knew the sender of might get him arrested, Grindelwald. The man sent a card that was actually very ordinary for a Christmas card, as he just wished a happy holiday and the usual well wishes. The gift however only made Nick sigh, as it was a small log of the Hawaiian fern that Ollivander had recommended for the fire salts. Of course he was aware that I was looking into getting some of this, he thought as he put it away for later. What sort of wood is that? Ron asked, seeing the log before it was placed in the realm. A type of Hawaiian fern that grows near volcanoes. It's a very unpopular wood for wands due to how picky it is. Nick said casually. Who sent it? Harry asked curiously. A fan of my work. Nick answered vaguely without lying. Why don't I ever got rare wood as a gift? Ron complained, and they laughed. After that they went to breakfast and everyone was chatting about the stuff they got. All of Nick's friends were pleased with his gifts, which was perfect to him considering he barely spent more than a day getting them ready. The rest of the day after that was spent with them hanging out and generally relaxing as they waited for the ball to get set up. Chapter 547, Yule Ball. You know, I really would have liked to be asked before the last possible minute to do this. Nick said as he weaved a grand illusion over the Great Hall. Dumbledore had apparently gotten the brilliant idea of getting the school's resident illusion specialist involved in decorating the Great Hall for the ball right before said ball. The Great Halls were already extravagant to begin with streamers, fancy tables, and cutlery, and even the floor transfigured into a smooth mirror-glossed finish. Add on the enchanted ceiling that showed the stars overhead and it was quite a memorable sight. However, Dumbledore wanted to push it even further and thus had Nick, who the entire Hogwarts staff recognized as an expert of illusions, brought to make things truly unforgettable. Flitwick may be a charms master, but his field of study was physical charms, so while he knew his share of illusions he was far behind Nick, who actively studied and pushed the subject further. Nick's illusions were terrifyingly realistic as well, since at one point in time he made it appear as though an army had suddenly appeared outside Hogwarts when he was testing an illusion spell in his free time. The sight, sound, feeling and even smell of an army was all there, and it was only thanks to the illusion detecting ring that Snape had ordered years prior that the residents of the castle hadn't made fools of themselves, including Dumbledore. Needless to say, quite a few students in the school were suddenly enlightened about the greatness of illusions, and the tomes on the subject were unavailable for quite some time afterwards. It was at that point that the entire staff of the school recognized Nick as the expert in the subject within the walls of the castle. For the ball, what Dumbledore wanted was to extend the illusion from the enchanted ceiling to cover all the walls so that it appeared that they were standing in the sky itself. Nick agreed to the matter with only a little complaint at the short time he had to work with. After all, this wasn't some static image that he was conjuring up that may as well be fancy wallpaper. No, he needed to add a feeling of vastness, movement, and synchronicity with the enchanted ceiling overhead so that the desired effect could be achieved, which required serious control and precision to pull off. And done. Nick stated as the spell was finally done and took effect as the surroundings shimmered and changed to match the ceiling's appearance. The really difficult part was to make the illusion truly reflect the heavens above that he couldn't actually see. Thanks to the long hours of staring at them because of the twilight style, however, Nick had nearly every star in the sky memorized. Marvelous work, my boy. Flitwick said excitedly while looking around him. I am in agreement with Phileas, you have truly outdone yourself. Dumbledore said with a pleased smile. I would certainly hope so, considering I spent nearly half my entire energy pool on it. Nick said with a half-hearted complaint. This illusion was both not simple and it needed to last for a considerably amount of time, so naturally the cost to create it was quite heavy. I imagine those attending the ball will start arriving shortly, right? He asked, changing the subject. Dumbledore nodded. Indeed they should be, and I do hope that you enjoy yourself during this time as well. The old goat said right when the other judges started to arrive. Nick was quite surprised to see that Sirius himself had shown up with Amelia Bones hanging on his arm. It was a strange image, as her personality was almost the exact opposite of his in that she preferred to be serious, pun not intended, at all times, and wasn't a fan of pranks or jokes. While the war with Voldemort and subsequent decade in Azkaban had mellowed the man out considerably, Sirius was still very much a fun-loving and carefree person. One thing the man had on his side, however, was good looks, as once he recovered he had a rough charm to him that apparently even worked on women like Amelia. After that was Ludo Bagman, who either decided to go stag or just couldn't get a date for the event, not that Nick could tell which one with how the large man was acting. Ludo acted as though he was high on life just existing in the room, as he was all smiles and amazement at the scenery in the Great Hall. After that it was time for the students of Hogwarts to start arriving as they began to appear from the 4th year and beyond. Chapter 548, Yule Ball, 2. Harry and Ron showed up with Ginny and Padma Patil respectively as their dates, and Harry and Ginny were singled out to stand to the side. After that followed the Beauxbatons students and their dates, with Fleur and the captain of the Ravenclaw Quidditch team being paired together and thus singled out along with Harry and Ginny. Madame Maxime was paired up with Hagrid, unsurprisingly considering they had been openly flirting for months now. How anyone could appear surprised to see it was beyond Nick, but a few pulled it off. Finally it was Durmstrang's time to arrive, and more than a few people were surprised to see that Hermione was hung off the arm of Krum in a radiant manner. She really does clean up nicely, Nick thought while giving her a grin and a thumbs up. Luna had somehow managed to slip in the hall without anyone noticing, despite her wearing a flamboyant pink dress with added flowers and lots of puffy bits. It was just as unusual as its wearer, and Nick approved greatly as it suited her. The only accessory she had on was the bracelet that he had given her previously that allowed her to change her features to a minor extent, which she was currently using to keep her hair braided. It was an interesting use of the magic and Nick approved of it. Soon enough the champions and their dates were taken to the dance floor, and the band that was known as the Weird Sisters started playing. Watching Harry and Ginny dance was amusing, since it was clear that they were both total amateurs at it that lacked the coordination to not constantly step on the other's feet. Fleur's dance was much better, as even though her partner was distracted by her Vila allure the entire time, she was clearly trained how to dance with someone under such a condition. The best dancers of the champions though went to Krum and Hermione hands down. They glided across the floor in perfect sync in a standard waltz. Once the first song ended, it was finally time for the rest of the students to show off their dancing skills as well as order food for dinner. Unlike usual, there was an actual menu for the meal this time, but after looking it over, Nick instead opted for some of his sweetened lembas bread instead. Want a bit? He offered Luna, who looked like she didn't know what she wanted to order from the menu. Isn't that just bread? She asked, confused. It dawned on Nick that he might not have ever actually explained what lembas bread was when he ate it, so his friends were likely under the impression he just enjoyed bread. This is lembas bread, and a single bite is enough to fill someone for 3 days. I sweetened this one so that it is a bit like pound cake in flavor, he explained, and she looked interested. After trying it, she looked astonished to find that she did indeed feel full after a single bite. So that's why you eat this stuff so much? She said in understanding. Well, with that out of the way, want to make everyone else jealous? Nick asked with a grin. Luna's eyes lit up and she smiled happily before holding out her hand. Nick took it and gently led her to a nearby wall before doing something that no one there would forget for quite some time. He stepped onto the wall and began to walk up the side of it like it was the ground. Luna was besides herself at the novel idea of dancing on the wall, but Nick was much more of a braggart than that and eventually led her upside down, standing on the air itself overhead. Even the music stopped as the people in the room stared in amazement at them. Play something upbeat, won't you? Nick said with a grin at the band that snapped out of it and complied. In time with the music, Nick led Luna across the sky in a grand and flashy tango while everyone else could only watch in jealousy. Dumbledore had a grin of his own at the scene and mentioned something about being young again as he watched. The trick to what Nick was doing was that he was warping gravity in a small area around Luna and himself so that they were always falling in the direction of his choosing, so they appeared and felt like they were on solid ground so long as he kept a hardened platform of air above them under their feet. Doing this was an absolute flex on his part, and everyone who understood what he was doing knew it. Chapter 549, Yule Ball, 3. All in all, Nick was in a good mood for the majority of the ball after he finished showing up everyone else. Luna was in a similarly good mood but took the event as merely another unimportant social party, which was admittedly fairly true. It was amusing to see her interacting with the members of the other schools who all looks like they didn't know how to treat her. They couldn't be rude as she was here as Nick's date, and it would be like insulting him, which could end very unpleasantly. They also clearly wanted nothing to do with her strange manner of speech and fanciful attitude when talking about a creature that didn't exist. Nick was far more interested in a small beetle that was buzzing about the place, however. I must admit this woman is truly brave to act like this in front of so many powerful people, he thought before setting off a spark of lightning from thin air through the beetle's wings. Not enough to really hurt her or get noticed, but more than adequate for sending a message. Rita Skeeter left hurriedly in her beetle form after that, which meant she missed the conversation between Hagrid and Madame Maxime. Nick didn't mind that the woman used her animagus form to spy on others to get news, but Hagrid was a friend and the stigma of being labelled inhuman would be a heavy one indeed. Most people thought that Hagrid was the result of a failed spell of some sort, and Nick was more than happy to keep it that way. The man was not like Nick in that he could silence all opposition to his race with power, and that was perfectly fine. Hagrid was a kind and simple soul that loved magical creatures of all kinds and wouldn't retaliate should he be targeted for something. Nick knew that Rita's piece on the man's true nature would leave him shamed and ostracized heavily, and so moved to prevent it when the opportunity came. Sadly, I can't do anything for him in regards to Maxime's denial of her own true nature as a half-giantess. A shame really, as they made a good couple. Nick thought as he drank some punch that had been spiked by the twins. It wasn't anything strange that they put in it but merely scentless and tasteless alcohol. It certainly made things interesting as those experienced with alcohol recognized its effects on them instantly while everyone else merely lost all sorts of inhibitions. Nick was entirely unaffected by the alcohol as his body considered it a poison and burned it out before it could cause any problems. There was a slight downside to the drunken students, however, in the form of them getting frisky with their dates. More than a few couples left the ball to find quiet places to make out or more. The adults at the ball mostly all decided to allow it to happen as well, since it was merely a part of being young in their opinions. The next day, however, had Madame Pomfrey in a very bad mood as she had a sudden influx of people after morning after potions that told of a very eventful Christmas. Despite Luna getting a bit tipsy herself, Nick was not amongst that number as he was not interested in such a thing at this time. At the end of the ball he instead escorted her to the Ravenclaw common room and left for bed. "Ugh, make it stop," she begged in the morning as she and quite a few people were nursing nasty hangovers. "I could do that, but then you wouldn't learn anything," Nick said teasingly. "What are we even supposed to learn for this anyways?" Ron asked while rubbing her temple to try and relieve his headache. "To never trust any food that those two have interacted with for starters," Nick said with a chuckle as he pointed at the twins. Both of which were reveling in the suffering they had caused with wide smiles. "How aren't you miserable like us anyways?" Harry asked with a similar headache to Ron. "Oh, that? I am immune to alcohol apparently. I honestly had no clue until last night, but it is certainly a pleasant find," Nick said with a grin. That took a little of the wind out of the twins' sails, but not much. Obviously they had thought they had gotten one over on him, but clearly that wasn't the case, so their joy lessened a small amount. But compared to the pride at such a successful large-scale prank, it was a minuscule drop. At about noon Nick finally took pity on his friends and dispelled their hangovers with a simple cleansing spell. Comment. 8 comment. Vote. Chapter 550, Back to the Grind. After that things returned to normal as the champions continued to try and decipher the hint from the egg, and Nick focused on copying the library and clearing the room of hidden things. The second task was to be held on the 24th of February, and that meant only about 2 more months to prepare. That might seem like a lot, but the problem is that the champions had almost no idea what they should be preparing for, so they could only focus on a bunch of half-baked guesses that may or may not be true. For Nick, though, these next 2 months allowed him to make a great deal of progress in the 2 things he was focusing most of his attention on. For the room of hidden things, he had managed to grow his realm size by a 2% while absolutely flooding it with mana from all the magic he fed to it. As it stood right now, the mana in his realm was so dense that it rivaled his islands at this moment. This wasn't stolen mana like before either, but true generated mana from the ley lines within the planet of the realm. Thanks to this, Nick was finally confident in transferring the golden apple tree from the vault into his realm safely. Other than that, though, he had already removed everything from within the vault save the money needed to keep it open. Grim Grip was rather unhappy about this, but couldn't say anything about it due to the nature of the goblins' contracts over the vault. Nick scoffed at the goblins' indignation, however, as the greedy creatures thought that the contents of a vault would naturally pass to them eventually, so all the unique things getting removed from a vault stung at them. It made no sense, but that was just the way goblins saw things in general, so Nick could only shrug at it. There was a bit of a downside to transferring the tree to the realm, however, as the thing immediately devoured the mana in the air, greedily dropping the ambient levels to the current Earth standard. Thankfully, the ley lines produced enough mana that the tree stabilized and started to recover from its mana-deprived state. This drop in ambient mana, however, made Nick more focused than ever on emptying the room out. He was making good progress too, as he was almost exactly 75% done by the time the second task rolled around. Interestingly, the room also shrank as its contents did so. Now Nick could see from one end to the other with a little bit of effort. The amount of knowledge Nick had gained from the room alone was staggering as well, since he had recorded every curse and the knowledge written down that he found as well. He now had thousands of different curses recorded, and his personal library was now nearly twice the size of the Hogwarts public one. Speaking of the library, he had also gotten roughly 75% done with copying that as well. The final 25% though proved to be trickier, since it consisted of the Forbidden section and the Ancient section. For the Forbidden section, the tomes and scrolls there were cursed or in other languages that Nick wasn't the best at copying due to his auto-translating ability. He could copy the symbols of course, but his mind kept trying to write down what he read in English, which wasn't what he was wanting. Half the value of the information was how hard it was to understand after all. For the ancient section that also held true as the vast majority of the tomes, scrolls, and records there were in a lost or difficult to translate languages. Nick wanted his own library to be a faithful copy of the original, so he was forced to slow down so as to not accidentally translate a book instead of copying it perfectly. There was a boon that came with him copying so much knowledge, however, as some of that knowledge stuck. It was a mere fraction of what he copied, but it was still an improvement to his knowledge base. Finally the 24th of February rolled around and it was time for the second task to commence. Once again the bleachers of the Quidditch pitch had been used to house the crowds that came to watch the event. In the center of the field stood a huge cubical grey chamber with a single bronze-looking door that was otherwise unimpressive looking. Everyone there looked at the thing in confusion as they simply couldn't understand what they were looking at. Soon enough Ludo Bagman started announcing the nature of the task as well as what its main objective was in the form of a single kidnapped person that each champion needed to rescue. Chapter 551, Second Task. It was also clear that Harry had figured out precisely what Nick had to do with the task if the glare he had was any indication. Nick could only smile and shrug at his friend on the field, though, as he really wasn't allowed to disclose the contents of the task ahead of time. Besides, it is far more entertaining this way. Nick thought with a chuckle. Now then, if the champions would please draw lots, we can decide the order by which they will be participating. Ludo said loudly as he went around with the straws. Krum drew the short straw and Harry the middle one, so the order went Krum, Harry, and finally Fleur, who got the longest straw and had a look of relief as a result. Don't go thinking that watching the others will be of much use to you here, I am not that sloppy a designer. Nick thought with a scoff seeing this. There was quite a few oohs and ahs when Krum went into the chamber and large projections of the inside of the chamber appeared overhead. The chamber was made in such a way that the environment was chosen the moment a hand touched the door, so no one noticed that it shifted before he entered. Krum got the forest environment for his run of the dungeon, which Nick had to admit was easily amongst the most challenging. While the environment wasn't innately hostile, the golems in the forest were heavily based on magical creatures found in such an environment and as a result had a lot of ambush predators in it. Having to maintain constant vigilance and alertness of one's surroundings took a heavy toll on one's mind, so Krum was in for a bit of a rough time. The boy's role as a seeker, however, made him acutely able to spot the slight differences that showed the golems' locations within the forest as he traveled through it. This didn't mean that he got away unscathed, however, as the camouflage of the magical beasts still caused him serious trouble. As for finding the treasures in the forest, he had mixed results, as he got some and missed others depending on the amount of effort it took to uncover them. In a way, he was brute forcing his way through the task with only taking the treasure gathering as a secondary objective. Not to say that this was an incorrect way to do it, merely that by the end of the task he would have less points than if he took his time and thoroughly searched for the treasures and actually studied the task. A fact that became apparent when Krum finally found the person he was meant to rescue, Hermione. She did not look happy as she was trussed up in a web in a shadowy area that obscured the golems guarding her. Let's see how you deal with XXXX grade dangerous creatures that specialize in ambush attacks. Nick thought, watching with interest. For the forest environment, Nick had programmed the guardian golem based on a very dangerous creature that he had bullied a lot in recent times with Nazgul, acromantulas. For the average wizard, meeting one of these things in their natural environment was a single wrong step away from being a death sentence. Acromantulas were masters of stealth and were viciously intelligent hunters that could even learn how to speak despite lacking any sort of vocal cords. Unfortunately, their dark nature left them with ravenous hungers for flesh that had them destroy their habitat as they consumed everything within. Krum was clearly not well versed in the creatures, since he carelessly rushed towards Hermione, who was being used as bait to lure him in. She knew it too, as she yelled into the webbing covering her mouth in an attempt to warn him, but unfortunately Krum mistook that to mean she was happy to see him rescue her. His mistake was capitalized on by the golem that launched a web out of the shadows that bound his feet, causing him to trip. Krum's eyes widened in fear as the golem scurried out of the shadows at him, and more than a few people in the audience paled in fright or revulsion at the sight of the person-sized spider. Krum seemed to forget that his life wasn't really in danger and panicked at the attack and launched a bone-breaker curse at the golem. Nick shook his head at this. That's definitely points off for using dark magic, he thought, disappointed to see it. It wasn't even the most optimal use of the spell either, as the giant spider's crazy reflexes allowed it to sense and avoid the magic. Chapter 552, Second Task, 2. Krum finally recovered from his panic though and cast a wide-range attacking spell that the golem couldn't dodge. One needed to keep in mind, however, that these golems weren't the ones that almost perfectly imitated the real thing, but were instead heavily nerfed representations. Otherwise Krum wouldn't have even made it this far, as the real creatures would have long since killed him for his carelessness and reckless use of energy. Still the guy managed to defeat the golem eventually and rescue Hermione, who wasted no time at all scolding him and telling him what he could have done better. Krum looked a bit like a child that had been scolded by their parents under her admonishment, and everyone found it rather funny. Even Karkaroff had a wry smile at the scene, since he was aware that her strong-willed nature was the reason Krum was so interested in her to begin with. Some men just liked women like that after all, so who was he to judge? The task came to an end shortly after that, as the chamber kicked them out after counting out the number of treasures collected and golems defeated. Honestly speaking, Krum didn't do all that bad, as he collected 12 of the 50 treasures and defeated 28 of the 40 golems in that environment. The judges then started to grade his performance based on other factors that served additionally as pointers on how to improve. He got a 7 across the board, which Nick admitted was fair all things considered. Unlike in the canon, Karkaroff didn't show blatant favoritism this time and truly judged it fairly. There was a brief break, after which it was time for the next champion to enter the chamber. Nick smirked when he noticed the look of disbelief on Fleur's face when it was revealed that Harry was not in the forest like Krum was, but rather was in a desert. Looks like he got one of the easy environments, lucky him. Nick thought as he watched his friend look around in confusion. Like any real desert, there was not really a bunch of places one could hide stuff besides under stuff or in the sand. As a result, the golems for this particular environment had been bumped up in terms of difficulty to compensate for the ease that would come from finding treasure. Speaking of golems, here comes the first set now. Nick thought, seeing the shifting sand heading in Harry's direction. Harry also noticed it and sent a quick reducto at the golems, forcing them out from under the sand with the blast. The creatures that they were based off of were known as Scorpioches and were basically giant black scorpions about a meter in length. Unlike Acromantulas, they were naturally creatures and not dark in nature, so they were hyper-intelligent but highly territorial. They also hunted in groups of 3 by burrowing under the sand to catch their prey off guard. Harry immediately figured out their weakness, however, and hit them with a glacius spell that froze them solid. As insects, the creatures had no way to thermoregulate, so by dropping the temperature around them so drastically, Harry effectively killed them in an instant. He quickly made his way to the large rocky structure in the distance while fighting the various golems that showed up as he collected treasures left and right. Unlike Krum, however, Harry took his time, so he not only got more treasures but he also got far less injuries. Finally reaching the rocky structure, Harry carefully checked the surroundings before trying to sneak in and grab his hostage in the form of Ron, who looked quite calm given that he was being guarded by a mirage viper nest. Mirage vipers were considered XXX graded dangerous creatures by themselves, but the trick was that they very rarely were by themselves. They were a rainbow-scaled type of serpent that had illusion-based magical abilities, which was where they got their name from, and usually lived in a nest of a breeding pair and 3 offspring. They were also highly venomous and not the biggest fan of intruders in their nests. Ron knew that this was a part of the trial and remained silent as Harry got attacked from 5 different directions the moment he stepped foot in the area. The boy barely managed to create a shield around himself that stopped the snakes before they faded away and repositioned themselves for another attack. Harry attempted to use Parcel Tongue to get out of fighting the serpents, but unfortunately they were golems and not actual snakes, so the ability fell flat even if the attempt earned points in Nick's opinion. Avoiding unnecessary fights is always a good choice, so it was a good idea on Harry's part even if it didn't pan out. Chapter 553, Second Task, 3. Once Harry realized the issue, he moved to more aggressive solutions immediately as he started to use the immobilization charm to one by one keep the golems still before knocking them out. Harry and Ron got kicked out of the chamber once the number of treasures and defeated enemies were finished being counted. Harry collected 40 of the 50 treasures and defeated 42 of the 50 golems of that environment. The judges made it clear that they were impressed with his performance, and Harry took the lead in points for this task with 2 10s and 2 9s from the judges. Obviously the headmasters of the other 2 schools were the 9s in this situation, as they nitpicked a few small details so they didn't have to give him a perfect score. It was petty but to be expected, so no one made a fuss about it. Once again there was a small break before it was finally time for the final champion to enter the chamber. Fleur got really unlucky, however, as she got the urban environment for her task. Madame Maxime also grimaced when she saw this, as Nick had given each of the judges a rough list of which environments were the most difficult for this task. This was so they could make fair judgments, and the urban one was the single hardest environment to deal with. Unlike the others that had magical creatures that were not overly intelligent, the urban environment was stocked with golems that imitated wizards and as such were each not so easy to deal with as a result. That didn't even consider the sheer amount of hiding places that treasures could be placed both vertically and horizontally. Perhaps she may surprise us all and do better than expected. Nick thought calmly. While he didn't like her attitude and way of trying to fix the problem she had with his avian dominion, he didn't hate her or anything like that. If anything, she barely even registered in his mind as anything more than background scenery. It may seem like arrogance, but in canon her peak was this tournament, as she basically just became a housewife within 2 years after it. She was talented for sure, but she simply never put that talent to good use, and so Nick couldn't be bothered to elevate her status beyond being a mere background character. Fleur barely entered the chamber, however, when she ran into her first snag in the form of vertical obstruction. Cities were rarely straightforward things, and the chamber's environment reflected that, as without getting to the top of a building it was impossible to scope out the area effectively. Fleur also seemed to realize this and chose to risk it by entering the crumbling apartment building in front of her. The magical image followed her as she carefully picked up treasures that she could see while cautiously checking the building for golems. There weren't any there, however, as that was one of the things Nick had programmed into this environment to give the challengers a fighting chance. The first 3 buildings were the golems' no-fly zones, so that the challengers could adjust a bit before the golems increased the difficulty considerably. It needs to be understood that since the golems imitated people, any battle that breaks out will draw more of them to check it out. This meant, unlike with the magical creature golems that roughly stayed in a certain area, the wizard golems can in fact join up in large groups. Even ants can kill an elephant if there are enough of them, and these golems are no ants compared to Fleur, but merely weaker wizards. There was strength in numbers, so Fleur needed to play this very carefully if she wanted any chance of completing her task. Much like in canon, Fleur's hostage was none other than her sister, who was totally just chilling at the far end of the environment, confident that her sister was coming to get her. This was reflected in the magical images projected to the audience, but those who understood the difficulty of this task could only shake their heads at her confidence. Finally, Fleur got to the top of the building with a few issues with the structural integrity of the building, but otherwise smoothly. She did something unexpected, however, and cast a spell on herself that Nick figured out thanks to being able to see Gabriel's reaction to it on one of the magical projections. A bloodline tracking spell, a good move considering the situation. He though with a nod. Thanks to that spell, Fleur knew exactly where in the environment her sister was and surprised everyone with her next action. Chapter 554, Second Task, 4. Fleur actually created a huge commotion in one of the buildings after seeing the golems wandering the ruined streets. Bright lights, loud sounds, the whole thing, and when the golems went to investigate in large numbers, she directly shattered the supports of the building, collapsing it on top of them, killing 15 at once. Even Nick was left speechless at the flat-out terroristic tactic that he never even thought of someone using in this way. Even more, Fleur merely moved the rubble in order to collect the treasures that had been hidden within the building. That tactic only worked once, however, as the golems now knew better than to go into a building en masse. How clever! She also realized that numbers were going to be her biggest obstacle, and thus made it so that the golems wouldn't group up so easily again. Nick thought approving her plan, since it was a good way to make the task easier. Not trivial, however, as Fleur soon learned when she got into a fierce fight with 4 golems at once when she tried to pick off one that was alone, only to find out it was a trap. The golems were semi-sentient in nature, so they could plan and make strategies as well. Nick didn't create truly artificial people, however, as that was a whole moral issue that he didn't want to deal with. The golems were more along the lines adaptive AI, with a hard limit encoded into them to keep them from truly blurring the line of what was and was not a person. He could make artificial people if he wanted to, but Nick knew that was a whole thing best avoided if possible. If he really wanted, Nick could probably create actual people in his realm, but that also came with its own set of issues. Anyways, Fleur was actually doing pretty good so far, as she had adapted to a far more cautious approach to the environment. Her current strategy involved disillusioning herself and sneakily casting knockout spells on the golems after checking to make sure they were truly alone. In a way, she was acting the role of an assassin, which more than a few people also noticed and mentioned. Her treasure collecting was far behind even crumbs, but everyone agreed that was to be expected given the environment. It was simply far too time-consuming to search out anything but the most obvious treasures, and demolishing every building in the simulated environment would be a very bad idea, since it would effectively place one on flat ground in sight of every golem in the chamber. It was clear that Fleur was aiming to get a full sweep of the golems instead, in order to offset her lack of treasures, which Nick was willing to admit was a perfectly valid option. Her environment favored combat over seeking treasure after all, so the plan had solid viability so long as she was careful, which she was. The longer she behaved like an assassin, the more she started to improve in it to an almost scary degree. She went from clumsily sneaking around to almost predatorily snuffing out each golem silently. By the time she got near the building Gabriel was held in. Madame Maxime had a very concerned look watching this, as it did not paint a good image of Fleur. Most of the crowd watching the task were starting to think she was actually an assassin. Thankfully, the task was almost over as she finally entered the building cautiously, but all the English wizards stiffened when they saw the guardian golem, a Death Eater. Unlike all the other golems that were weak dumb minions, this one was borderline human in how it functioned. As a result, it rolled out of the way when Fleur tried to catch it off guard like the other golems. What followed was a perfect example of magical combat as both Fleur and the golem traded spells and shields, devastating every spot nearby as they took the fight outside to keep it away from Gabriel. Once outside, things got even more heated as wide-range destructive spells were used. Those who had seen actual combat watched on sternly at the uncomfortably accurate showing of the horror of the previous two wizarding wars. All of the judges gave Nick a hard look at this, but he remained unfazed watching the projection. Eventually, however, Fleur managed to take advantage of a small opening to finish the golem off. Nick clapped at this, much to everyone else's confusion, until he explained that she had successfully defeated every golem in the task, which deserved applause. Chapter 555, The Danger. It wasn't standing ovation impressive, but it certainly deserved recognition. That was what Fleur and Gabriel exited the chamber to, much to their confusion. The applause died down as the judges scored the results along with the results showed by the chamber. 50 out of 50 golems defeated and 20 out of 50 treasures collected. In terms of score, Fleur actually beat Harry as she got 3 10s and a 9. This set her in second place total for the tournament so far, with Harry just ahead of her. Crumb was last, but he didn't seem bothered by this and even congratulated the other two for their great performances. The final task was announced for June 24th, and after the media got all the information they wanted, Nick moved the chamber to the empty room adjacent to the Dada classroom, and a door from the classroom to it was made. The leftover treasures in the chamber were removed by Nick and replaced for things that students would be less inclined to steal before it started seeing regular use, but that was it. All of his friends were steamed after Harry revealed that Nick was the one behind that task. "I did say you would understand when the moment was right," Nick defended with a shrug. "You could have at least helped me prepare better. I spent the last month thinking the task was underwater," Harry said in mock anger. He wasn't actually angry at Nick since he knew about the NDA, but that didn't mean he was going to pass up the opportunity to give Nick a hard time. "There was nothing to prepare for in your case. The treasure hunting was covered by your seeker training and the rest was entirely randomized to prevent you three from truly preparing so everyone could see your actual skills," Nick explained honestly. "What was up with that whole hostage situation thing anyways?" Ron asked curiously. "Well, I needed to create an end goal to light a fire under the champions, so to speak. None of you were in actual danger thanks to that badge you were wearing, but the champions obviously couldn't know that, or they would have gone out of their ways to collect points rather than rescuing you. No point in a competition that no one gives their best for after all," Nick said honestly. "Why did only I have to get tied up though?" Hermione complained. "That was entirely the golem's choice, not mine. I just made the thing act like a normal acromantula, so that's not my fault," Nick said with a shrug. "I think I am glad Harry got the desert rather than the forest. I bloody hate spiders," Ron said with a shiver at the mere thought. "Well, it was a 1 in 10 chance for each of the environments, so it was anyone's bet who got what," Nick said honestly. "Which was the hardest?" Daphne asked curiously. "The urban one, hands down. Between the wizard golems and the huge amount of strange places treasure could be hidden, it was in a league all its own," Nick said seriously. "Now that you mention it, those golems did act like actual people kinda, especially that last one," Tracy said with a thoughtful look. "What was that place based off of anyway?" Harry asked curiously. "What the world likely would look like if muggles and wizards were to break out into war at this exact moment," Nick said seriously. "What? We wouldn't destroy a city like that," Ron said offended. Nick shook his head. "First, you are heavily underestimating the amount of power a wizard has at any given moment, and second, most of the damage would be from the muggles, not us," he said honestly. All of his friends were in disbelief, but they could tell that he wasn't joking at all and meant what he said. "Since when were muggles so scary?" Ron muttered in confusion. "Since about 50 years ago, when they came up with a weapon that matched the greatest power wizards have to this day, the nuclear bomb. It takes a wizard on mine or Dumbledore's level most of our power to destroy an entire city. The muggle have hundreds or thousands of bombs capable of the same," Nick answered honestly. Hermione tried to argue that that would be a last resort kind of thing, but Nick had to explain just how terrifying wizards were for the average muggle. A single above-average wizard could brainwash the entire muggle government with ease, and that sort of power was a scary thing. It would thus not come as a surprise to see muggles go straight for the deep end if a war broke out between them and wizards. Chapter 556, The Time Approaches. This was admittedly a pessimistic way of looking at it, since besides testing, those weapons had only been used offensively twice. Soon enough, though, this argument will become pointless as Grindelwald's ritual drew to completion, rendering the vast majority of muggle weaponry ineffective. Nick was fairly certain of the date of the ritual, as well as there was only one that would serve this purpose perfectly: Beltane. At that time the Earth's mana skyrockets for a brief few hours before settling down again. Grindelwald's ritual will either increase the duration of this spike until it becomes the new normal or use the many sacrifices he made to flood the Earth with mana. It was hard to say exactly which it was, however, as both had the exact same preparatory steps in this case. Nick as a result redoubled his efforts clearing the room of hidden things and copying the library over the next 2 months. He had also started the process for early graduation, which caused some commotion as the ministry tried to avert the growing sense of unease that everyone had as the date of the ritual's completion neared. It was an instinctual sort of feeling that wizards' connection to magic told them about, but few truly knew where the source of this discomfort came from. The stronger one was the worse it was, as both Nick and Dumbledore had become twitchy and irritable the more the date drew closer. Dumbledore had enough self-control to maintain decorum, but Nick was forced to isolate himself to prevent any incidents as he got uncomfortably close to blasting someone apart for walking near him in the library. Being Didrik proved highly detrimental in this regard, as his actions went from 0 to 1,000 in an instant if he wasn't constantly careful. Still, by dropping the Room of Hidden Things task temporarily, Nick finally finished the library and seemed to vanish from the public eye entirely. He didn't eat in the Great Hall with the others, and no one had seen him in weeks. It started several rumors that he was doing something amazing again, but the subject of these rumors was rapidly sorting and breaking down the things in the Room of Hidden Things. When he was needed for something involving his early graduation, Dumbledore sent a house elf to get him. While the canon didn't expressly state it, Dumbledore was definitely aware of the room of requirement. Since Nick hadn't asked the room to make it private, the servants could still come into the room. The exams for the early graduation and in general were also starting up towards the end of March, so the school was in a rush to do well on them. Nick's exams were especially difficult compared to, say, the final year students, but were easy for him since he had long since surpassed that level of knowledge and skill. Finally though, Nick completed cleaning out the Room of Hidden Things right on April 18th. The realm's size had grown by about 10% from before he started cleaning out the room, and the mana density was suffocating within it at the moment, which led to the golden apple tree thriving. It also caused a strange discord between his original body and the one he used to copy the books in the library in terms of power. The secondary body originally was at the same level of power as the original, but after being exposed to higher concentrations of ambient mana for a long time, it had surpassed the original body's power and was at the peak of Tier 4 and needed but a small push to reach Tier 5. That wasn't to say that Nick's original body wasn't also growing rapidly in power, as it was about halfway through Tier 4 by its own passive growth. This led to a sense of altitude sickness in Nick, as it was as if his body was in a lowered oxygen environment and struggling to adapt. How does Flammel handle this feeling all the time? Nick complained mentally, as he was never truly comfortable anymore after reaching Tier 4. On the evening of the final day of April, Nick went to the headmaster's office since it was the last few hours before the ritual was completed. The time draws near, Dumbledore, he said seriously, and the tired old man nodded as he stood up from his desk. The dawning of a new era is upon us, and I only hope we have prepared for its arrival correctly. Dumbledore spoke softly, but Nick heard him clearly. Within 2 years a great enemy shall appear, and I will be forced to face them in battle and will likely fall at that time, Nick said, catching the old man off guard. Chapter 557, It Begins. What do you mean? The old goat asked, confused but worried. I received a prophecy of sorts a few years ago that spoke of Grindelwald's plan and what will come of it. In that foretelling, 3 ancient and powerful beings will be revived as a result of the ritual. One of them will more likely than not be my enemy and thus seek my life. I am unsure if I will have the strength to survive the battle with this body. But even after this body dies I will not, so I ask that you not judge me harshly when I return. Nick spoke softly and Dumbledore listened silently. Why have you not spoken of this sooner? The old goat asked sternly. Because before now I lacked the power to stand on my own against you. I could not risk it to reveal this before my safety was ensured. Selfish, I know, Nick said with more than a little shame. He knew that sharing this knowledge would likely allow others to prepare better for Zeus's return, but at the same time he was afraid of Dumbledore attacking him in hopes of staving off the future. The old man had done bad things in the name of prophecy before, so it was a valid concern. I understand. While I may wish that your fears lacked substance, I know better. I must ask, however, would removing you have changed anything at all? The old man asked gently. Nick shook his head. No, by the time I learned of this prophecy Grindelwald was already enacting his plan. All removing me would have accomplished was to leave the world defenseless against the being I will clash with. He said honestly. It was a harsh but fair assessment as far as Nick could tell of the situation. Then there is nothing for me to be concerned about. I have made many mistakes, so I dare not say I wouldn't make another should you have revealed this sooner. You did what you believed best and no one can fault you for that given the situation. Did you know that for the longest time I wondered what it was that drove you to seek power so fervently? I couldn't understand it. You were already well on your way to my level, yet you never slowed down. Dumbledore spoke calmly. The old wizard spoke of what he saw and felt when watching Nick's progress until they both felt the mana levels start to rise. Moments later the world lit up like a light bulb as Grindelwald began his ritual. Nick immediately identified the route he took as the mana levels started to grow denser and denser with no sign of stopping even after the time of the Beltane surge came to an end. With that in mind, Nick started calculating exactly how long Grindelwald's ritual could extend the surging of mana. The answer he got was just short of a single year. 3 days short in fact, which meant that the mana levels around the world would soon stabilize at a certain point. It did too as the light faded and Nick felt the mana stop growing even if it was chaotic at the moment. Sweet Merlin! It's almost 10 times denser than my island before the ritual. Nick thought in shock. Call an emergency meeting with the school, bring the other schools as well. Everyone is probably panicking right now and you are respected enough to calm them down. He said seriously, and Dumbledore nodded in agreement. What of yourself? He asked seriously. I'm going to go strengthen the barrier keeping the stuff in the forest away from the school. It might be calm at the moment, but after everything grows more powerful from this amount of mana, things will get dicey as they try to leave the forest. Nick said seriously, and the old man nodded before grabbing a metal badge from his desk. This is a key to those wards. It will allow you easy access to the core of the barrier. He said as he handed it to Nick. I'm off then. Nick said before transforming into his animagus form and teleporting to the Forbidden Forest's edge. After turning back, the badge hummed a bit and had a sort of pull towards a certain spot that Nick found was the keystone to the barrier. Immediately he used his access to start strengthening the repulsion aspect of the barrier to the point it started to become visible from the energy it was consuming to empower itself. It was like a heat distortion in the air, but otherwise still transparent like normal. That should hold against anything tier 4 and below, he thought seriously, hoping that was good enough for now. Chapter 558, It Begins, 2. Like Nick expected, there was mass panic in the school as all the students could feel the dense mana in the air. Dumbledore called an emergency meeting in the Great Hall, which everyone attended because they were all awake despite the time. There he revealed that this was the doing of Grindelwald, which seemed to remind everyone that the man had been sacrificing towns for quite some time now. Dumbledore also made it clear that there were dark times ahead for them all, as the entire Muggle world was now undoubtedly going to learn of magic's existence and may retaliate against wizarding kind. Then in typical Dumbledore fashion, the man spewed some inspirational bullshit that made everyone feel better. The next month after that was rough for the world as animals and magical beasts evolved or underwent atavism before causing even more chaos in the Muggle world. The ministries globally tried their best to suppress the rising tide of magical sightings, but even without the usual technology to communicate, there was always gaps in the net that some fish got through. So by the end of May, the majority of the world was somewhat aware of the existence of magic. At that point, the ministries went full 360 and began openly acting as a peacekeeping organization by campaigning to the Muggle populace. The governments, however, were less than pleased at the state of things, and the ugliness of humans reared its head as civil war broke out on an almost global scale, as ambitious people took advantage of the situation to form war bands to raid supplies and take territories. In but a single month, the world had been set back to the Middle Ages in nearly all regards. Medicine from before the ritual that was cheap was now worth its weight in gold, as the technology to mass produce it no longer worked in most cases, and the war bands were hoarding it fiercely. While many would like to assume that wizards were better off than the Muggles, that simply was not true. Without the statute of secrecy being enforced, a great deal of wizards dissatisfied with the laws of the ministry started to do whatever they wanted. Some joined the war bands to be treated like royalty by the Muggles, who sought protection from the many new magical creatures that roamed the world. The vast majority of wizarding kind was still under the ministries, but those with power and ambition had left for the most part. The cities had also become devastated places as the many new or transformed magical beasts attacked them, causing much destruction that couldn't be repaired as the machines that Muggles relied on no longer worked. The death toll went up every day from murder, magical beast attacks, natural disasters that came more frequently, and disease. Hogwarts and Hogsmeade had become prime real estate as many flocked to Dumbledore for protection. Even though he never accepted it, the old man was effectively made king by the people around him, with Hogwarts being turned into the symbol of his power. The Triwizard Tournament was unanimously ended with the person with the most points being declared the winner, which was Harry in this case. After which the other schools rushed back to their own homelands to try and control the situation. Nick had been especially busy as he was early graduated and went to work with his army of Atronax, putting out fires all over the English Isles. The ministry turned a blind eye to the fact that he clearly had this army before the world went nuts, since he was helping massively. The Atronax repelled the magical beasts due to their almost all-inclusive elemental typings and high tier 3 power. Even the dragons that had broken free of wizarding control after evolving or undergoing atavism were repelled if enough Atronax were present. Beyond military applications, however, the Atronax worked as laborers since they never tired and were able to take orders. Nick himself had moved out of Hogwarts and was operating out of his island that was now roughly pinpointed by the populace since he sent Atronax out regularly. There was even a whole group of Muggles that had moved to that area to settle in hopes that he would protect them. Besides using his Atronax, Nick also worked out a way to communicate over long distances after finding a star whose material turned out to have dimensional affinities that he was able to mix with a modified protean charm to create a budding magical communication system that had signal towers connected to mirror-like bracelets that could send and receive information in small amounts. The trick was that each bracelet was tied to one's magical frequency, so it worked like a phone number in that you had to connect to that frequency to communicate with that person. Chapter 559, Problems. There was still a problem with this method of communication in that the range of the signal towers was not that great and that the towers themselves were targets of magical beasts and the war bands that knew once communications were back up it would only be a matter of time before others would start being able to move against them. The biggest advantage they had at the moment was that it took too long for someone to report seeing them, and as a result they were nearly impossible to wipe out since they were rarely still in the same place the report said they were. Once a near instantaneous method of communication like with those bracelets was implemented, though that would change. One needs to remember that the majority of those in the war bands were Muggles, so while the wizards could probably escape easily, the others would not be so lucky. With that understood, the bands worked to impede the expansion of the method beyond Nick's current region. Nick himself was helpless about this, as he simply didn't have enough Atronax to protect every tower without letting the magical beasts run rampant. By the end of June there was a total of 5 towers in the English Isles, with 4 of them being in his territory and the final being at Hogwarts to help Dumbledore with managing the situation over there. There had been other factors that had popped up as well during the time after the ritual changed the world in the Isles. Production-type wizarding families, or wizards in general, were raking in money by the fistful. The reason for this was for a single simple reason: food. Without the vast tracts of farmland that was only doable by huge amounts of people or machines, food was now a very big problem. Many isolated farms had been ravaged by the magical beasts and war bands, so the production of food had been dropped so low that mass starvation was a very real issue. That was where the production-type wizards came in, as they grew crops many times larger than normal that they sold to the communities willing to pay for it. Dumbledore didn't have this issue thanks to Professor Sprout and Hagrid already having established gardens that merely got expanded. Nick, though, had to come up with a way to feed the people under him efficiently, as fishing was simply not sustainable for the increasingly large population he had flocking to under his banner. He wasn't really surprised to see that most of those wizards who sought him out were craftsmen that assumed he would favor them as a craftsman himself. As for production-type wizards that could grow food, he had a total of 2, and they were heavily guarded by his most powerful Atronax and at least 2 decently powerful vampires, since the vampire community in the Isles had all moved to his settlement under the orders of the royal clan. There was a bit of backlash about this at first, but Nick took care of that with a simple public statement. "If you don't want to deal with them, leave." It was blunt and more than a little rude, but Nick had no patience for petty squabbles about the nature of the vampires. No one even needed to worry about them anyways, since he had created fountains of blood using Daedric runes that kept them perfectly civil so long as they wanted to be. Any troublemakers were made examples of not by Nick but by the vampires themselves, which helped their public image immensely. Thanks to the golems and Atronax that he created, Nick's area on the map was already starting to take the shape of a city with high enchanted walls and architecture that was a mix of Dwemer and Elvish by his own design. The buildings were a strange mix of soft-looking curves and sturdy stone and metal construction. If one imagined all of this with the way nature appeared before the ritual, then they would be sorely mistaken. Plant life had also evolved after the mana density had increased, so all of the deforested areas and damaged environments globally had rapidly filled with new tall powerful trees and plants. The world had really been reset to a degree, which was admittedly a good thing, as the problems caused by pollution were rapidly being cleared up by magic. The biggest problem, however, was the creatures that spawned from magic adapting them to their toxic environments. Fish with poisonous flesh, birds that dripped oil as they flew that was highly flammable, and then there was the treants that were starting to pop up. Trees given intelligence by the mana they took in that remembered the things people did and made their displeasure known to any unlucky enough to cross their path. Chapter 560, Problems, 2. These malicious beings were a very big problem due to an innate ability they all had: nature magic. The treants had the innate ability to command the plant life around them via magic, which meant that should they leave their forests and find themselves on farmland, they effectively turned it into a honey trap that in truth only promises death. This unfortunately resulted in every tree within a certain distance of a city or farm being forcefully removed. Nick wasn't the one who had this problem due to his area being near the sea and thus nearly barren of trees to begin with. Dumbledore, however, was having serious problems with it thanks to the Forbidden Forest and other trees near Hogwarts and Hogsmeade. The biggest problem that Nick had, however, was the sea beasts that already lived near his island having transformed into more powerful and aggressive beings that made the sea unsafe. Speaking of the island, Nick's mana-gathering array with the new normal level of mana in the world had created a pocket of near-toxically dense mana within the island. For him and Dobby it wasn't a problem, but the creatures living on the island were having trouble adapting to it. Due to this, Nick had little choice but to shrink the array to around the manor since he wasn't intending to cause undue suffering to the residents of the island. The situation in the English Isles was also unfortunately amongst the best in the world, as beyond France that had Flamel there was only a handful of powerhouses that people could rely on, which devolved most of the rest of the world into savage kill or be killed states. Most of the ministries had barely managed to set up their own small refuges, but the situation was bleak for them as they lost more and more lives to beasts and war bands that were interested in their resources. Amongst these chaotic times, powerful hidden organizations or individuals popped up to seize power for themselves. One such organization was none other than the Order of the Golden Sands, led by the one known only as the Elder, who was a powerful being that easily suppressed the beasts in their territory. Unfortunately, the organization was wizard supremacy based, and as a result any muggles that sought shelter under them were enslaved to provide for the wizards. Without the weapons that made them a force to be feared, muggles were unfortunately vastly outmatched at this point, and the wizards knew it. As a result, on a global scale the muggle population dropped even lower than the ministries had estimated, as barely 3 billion humans were left on the planet. By June the situation had reached a sort of balance globally, but the death toll was still growing, as it was a tenuous one at best. "My lord, I assure you this one can handle the situation whilst you are away," Dobby said when Nick showed a desire to leave to go check on the god he found previously. "I am not doubting your competency, but I am reluctant to step away in the chance that something requiring my attention should appear," Nick said with a sigh as he went over the paperwork he had for his settlement. Economic reports, battle reports, technological reports, and resource statistics, to name a few things he had to deal with. Nick had even established an adventurers guild in his territory whose members were tasked with exploring the strange new world around them and handling beast populations, as well as reporting on any new species of plants or animals they spot. It came as little surprise that it was mostly the younger generation that joined this guild and were being trained by golems. Nick prepared for this job. "In the last month there has been no new changes in the situation, my lord, so I find your concerns unfounded," Dobby argued sternly. Nick sighed. "I know that, but I am still worried," he said honestly. "You will only be gone a mere day or two at most. If we cannot handle that amount of time without your presence, then this settlement was doomed from the start," Dobby said with finality, and Nick couldn't really argue with that logic. "I suppose I'll be going then," he said before turning into his animagus form and vanishing in a crackle of electricity. The Dwemer ruin was just as he had left it, with no easily noticeable differences despite there being more mana than last time. The molten metal lake, however, was an entirely different matter, as the whole thing swirled around the crystal in its center like a whirlpool while shrinking, and the moment he stepped foot in that chamber Nick stiffened as he felt a gaze upon him.
Thanks for listening.